totally understand parents saying like, what I want to teach my kids a lot of these skills. And I'm like, I hear you, but why not get the additional support, right? When we tell parents like coaching means that we're going to help your kid better manage their time, make their bed when you in the morning, and like really develop those executive functioning skills. They're like, oh yeah, please help me do that because I don't want to fight with them another time. So really looking at it's like how can we get families and communities to think about the power of us all working together, and schools being the crux of where that can happen.
I mean, because it really does take a village, right, to raise a child. Mm-hmm. It's not just mom and dad, because your child is also spending from 7 a.m. until 2:30 p.m. with other adults and other environments where they're learning things, skills are being pushed upon them, and they're able to develop those executive skills and functions. All right, guys, welcome back to a brand new episode of the Hart Hustle podcast. Now, I'm incredibly excited because I'm sitting across this digital table with an amazing leader, founder, and CEO. I'm sitting across the table from Maria, who is the CEO and founder of Clayful Health. Maria, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
So, one of the things that we often talk about on the podcast is our heart and hustle. Now, when it comes to Clayful Health and the work that you guys do, the heart is easy to understand, but I think we need to articulate the reason behind why this, I would say, venture was actually started. In our previous conversation, you mentioned a kind of a stark reality where we started talking about an 8-year-old who was not only identifying what suicide was, but was also following through with that incredibly horrific act. So why was that something that kind of opened your eyes to this space, or what's a little bit about your background, why this is so important?
Yeah, so I've been working in education and education technology pretty much my whole career. Even when I was, in high school, I was teaching at the nearby middle school and I've always had a space in my heart for working with kids. So during COVID, I was really looking at, the impact of us being locked up in our houses for a long time and how that was going to affect, obviously it was affecting all of us in some way, shape, or form. But for kids, it was, let's say it's different, right? It's, you don't have structure. You're not socializing at this time. Like you're building all these social skills. You're not being exposed to people that are different than you or who are like you and finding sort of ways to connect to yourself and to others. So as I started to sort of talk to families and started to realize that like, oh, there's this generation is going to be a little bit different. And this article that you mentioned starts coming out, and that more start coming out around like this youth mental health crisis. And then we start talking about like how this youth mental health crisis is making its way into schools and all of those things put together. I'm like, oh no, like we have to do something. We have to do something fast, because over time we've had mental health become more of a, let's say, like common topic over the last, decade or so. But we hadn't really had it blow the lid off the way that COVID did. And it felt like it basically got to a reckoning, where we realized, oh, there's a crisis, right? And beyond that, this crisis is affecting everybody, and schools are at the center of kind of the inflection point.
I mean, it's really just scary to think about where the current state of the mental health of a general young population is. I was born in 1990, so I might be dating myself for everybody here who's on the podcast, but I grew up in a world where when I was 8 years old, I was kind of worry-free. There wasn't a scary thing in the world. I was just living life being a kid, but it's not the world that kids live in anymore. They're exposed to so many images, social media, being cooped up in the house for years. There's one of my favorite sayings is, we will often study the things later in history that media often ignored. And I think we're in kind of one of those beautiful inflection points where it's like there is so much noise around us and static about what's happening in our communities, but often we just ignore them because we're looking at the next headline. We've got the presidential election going on, but it's like we have a crisis right underneath us, and we really need to pay attention to our younger generation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you're right. There's so much more exposed than we ever were. And the way the algorithms work is they're, exposed to one thing and they're like, oh, this is interesting, it's sad, it's, content as a whole is more polarizing. So it's designed to provoke a reaction, and then you become a little bit interested in this topic, and then all of a sudden that's all you're seeing and all you're learning about. And it ends up becoming it can become a really negative spiral very, very quickly. And when I was 8, I was like playing in the playground and just like playing with Barbies. So
Exactly.
different world. But with so much access to technology and to information, it means that we have to find protective factors, because if they're creating, if they're accessing all this information anyway using a device, then how can we also help them realize how to manage that device and how to use that device for good, when they need it?
What is the role that our school systems are supposed to play in a perfect world when it comes to mental health? I bring that question up because I'm not sure about you, but my parents never talked to me about mental
Hmm.
health. The conversations in which I was exposed to these things was actually in the academic setting. So is
Hmm.
that the responsibility of the schools, or what do you kind of think about that?
Yeah, look, like I think the responsibility has been evolving, and responsibility is an interesting word, right? Because it's more of a need in some ways than anything, right? When you talk about like what is the media ignoring? What they're not ignoring is the school shootings and these horrific acts that are happening in our communities. And when you look at the reasons why these are happening, it all goes back to mental health and mental health support, right? So we're seeing that the things that are affecting us as communities are because of these challenges that students are experiencing. Like really, we come from a place of, hey, let's work upstream and let's prevent and let's give young people life skills so that they never get to a breaking point. But when you're having school shootings or students harming themselves or someone else, schools have to be, not only is their responsibility, it's just like they need to be the ones providing that support because it's happening there, right? So I mean, I'm from Colombia, and I would say like our mental health didn't really enter our sort of family's conversation until later on. And when I came to the US, I was 10. I was playing, I brought my Barbies over, we were playing. It was like a very, let's say, like kid like childhood. But then, as I became a teenager and was like trying to find my way and trying to understand, like, okay, I'm Colombian, but now I'm sort of American. Like, what does this mean? And who am I? And how do I fit in? And like, do you wear limited too? Do you not? Like, what's Hollister? How do you how do you manage all these questions? Existential questions. And it sounds silly, but like that's what young people think about, right? And like because so much of what you're trying to do is fit in and figure out who you are and develop your personality. And if you're doing that in a place where you're exposed to all these other negative things, like that's going to come to a head, right? And schools are dealing with it, whether we talk about shootings, but like with the bullying as well,
Yeah.
right? Like that's becoming a huge issue, with lack of attendance, or like students being so anxious or depressed, like they don't want to go to school. So there's a lot of ways in which schools are being affected, and they're being forced into the conversation. And then in parallel, like I totally understand parents saying like, what I want to teach my kids a lot of these skills. And I'm like, I hear you, but why not get the additional support, right? When we tell parents like coaching means that we're gonna help your kid better manage their time, make their bed when you in the morning, and like really develop those executive functioning skills. Like, oh yeah, please help me do that because I don't want to fight with them another time as they're making their way out the door and running late. So really looking at it's like how can we get families and communities to think about the power of us all working together, uh, and schools being the crux of where that can happen.
I mean, because it really does take a village, right, to raise a child. It's not
Mm-hmm.
just mom and dad, because your child is also spending from 7 a.m. until 2:30 p.m. with other adults and other environments where they're learning things, skills are being pushed upon them, and they're able to develop those executive skills and functions. So, the question for Clayful is, we recognize this macro issue that we're dealing with. How are you guys, from a business perspective, kind of tackling this problem? Tell us about the model a little bit.
So it might not, this is not, probably not surprising, but we partner with schools. I believe so much in the power of schools and in supporting this work. And we provide on-demand coach-based support for students. So students can log onto an app either on their own device or on a school-issued device and connect with a human in 60 seconds. And the human piece is really important because I know, AI is all the rage right now. But so much of what we lost during COVID was that human connection, right? And giving young people another trusted source that they can talk to without judgment, but to talk about whatever's going on goes such a long way and helps them build those skills in real time when they're experiencing the things in real life, right? So that's when we talk about like what's the big innovation is that we're providing support on demand when students need it and where they need it in a way that hasn't been done before.
What are some of the early conversations that you have when you go to a school system and say, hey, listen, either we're thinking of this idea, right? Did you get any pushback? Did you have any like early low hanging fruit victories when you started approaching this with your solution? Or like, what was the ideation process like?
I would say, took a very the user-centered design approach, but realizing that there's a lot of users to design around, right? We have the student at the core. So a lot of these ideas of like why it's on demand came from students, like why it's chat-based came from students. Um, and but then we think about, okay, what does a school need? And not only what do they need to roll something out, but what do they need to be able to showcase the impact of something, right? So then we built out a curriculum that schools could use on an ongoing basis because it turns out that, yes, having a on-demand chat is really helpful for those students who already have those help-seeking behaviors,
Mm.
right? But if you don't yet know, how to read your emotions or how to do something when you have those emotions, then it's hard to do something about it, right? So we've developed this curriculum to both support schools in having these conversations and to help students start to like put two and two together of like, oh, when I feel this like heat in my chest, that's anger. What is that telling me and how do I work through it? And then we look at the impact measurement aspect of it, and that goes to funding and how do we get funding and how do we prove out that this intervention is working. And we measure everything from qualitative student feedback to anxiety and depression levels to attendance rates. We did a research last year that where chronically absent students who use Clayful attended school 2 more weeks than those who didn't.
No
So
way.
yeah,
Whoa.
isn't
That's
that
a
cool?
huge, like, that's a tangible impact. That's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
So what is it like when you first start getting back some of that data where you see like, hey, kids who are using Clayful are attending school 2 weeks more than kids who are not? Like, what are some of the internal excitement or some of the internal conversations you guys are having? Because that's like profound data.
It's amazing. We're super excited about it. And then so we were already gathering some of this information from students themselves, right? So we would ask, after in our feedback form, we would ask, like, are you more motivated to go to school or to learn after this conversation? And about 86% of them said they were. So we were getting that feedback, and then now we're able to actually tie it to real outcomes. So because school districts would say like, okay, you're saying students are saying this, but like, are they actually doing
Exactly
it?
right. Yeah.
So to be able to put two and two together there was really powerful. And now we're able to share, when school districts are looking at getting new resources, there's very robust processes and very, very intense due diligence that they do, which is great because we know that our funds are going to good places. Um, and as part of that, they look at the evidence base and say, okay, what have you seen in other places that we can expect to see and what's the outcome that we will expect to have. And, there's states that get funded based on attendance. So for them, it's like, oh, great, this can pay for itself, which is also big.
Wow. So did you realize that initially when you guys started going out with the value proposition? Because I'm guessing, right, as you go to the market, you have a solution for a problem to support mental health, but then you start finding all these different qualitative and quantitative different pieces of data where it's like, oh, well, if we position it as an attendance enhancer, that is directly tied to funding for the organization or the school district. We should position it in this way. So what was the iteration process like when you guys started going to market? This is really interesting to me.
This is where listening to your customer is so, so, so important, right? And like I said, we have all these different stakeholders, right? So you have the student, the teacher, the admin, the school admin, the district admin, the parents, right? So there, I spend a lot of my time out talking to school leaders. And even when my team has meetings, when we're reviewing data, like I will, go on the Peloton and listen to the calls. Sorry, Cody Rigsby, I'm no longer listening to you. But it's staying close to the customer is so, so, so important. And that's where we start getting some of these ideas, right? Where they're flagging the problems that they're having. And so we saw attendance come up a lot last year, and that's where we started to say, okay, let's make sure that we're measuring that to see where we're having an impact. Because we see anecdotally that students coming in and they're saying, you know, I don't want to go to school tomorrow because I didn't study for that test, or I don't want to go to school tomorrow because my friend isn't going to be there and I don't have any other friends to eat lunch with, or I don't want to go to school tomorrow because this person posted this about me on social media and I don't want to face them. And like those are all, again, very real things. And if we're able to work through that, it can change.
This is literally, I'm not saying this in a degrading way whatsoever, but this is like a mini life coach that's on
Yeah.
demand access that directly ties into our mental health. Because when I think about mental health normally, right, a younger age demographic or somebody who hasn't been through so much life doesn't have the language to be able to explain how they're feeling. And so me feeling like I don't want to go to school tomorrow because my friend's not going to be there, I have nobody to sit at lunch, means I'm feeling a little bit anxious and I don't have the language to be able to describe that. What an amazing model to be able to kind of, I'm not trying to pigeonhole you guys anyway, but in healthcare, we talk about like whole person health, right? You're looking at the entire individual and the challenges that they're facing, but giving them on tap, on demand support so they can navigate some of that stuff. Wow. What an awesome little model. This is so cool.
Thank you. I mean, I'm biased, obviously, but I agree.
Yeah.
Well, and like, I mean, these are examples for attendance, right? But think about the student who's like, they just found out something about a friend and they're really angry and they are want to get in a fight. And we've had kids come on and they're like, I'm gonna punch them right now. We're like, okay, let's play this out. What's gonna happen if you do? Right? And what are the potential outcomes of you? Like, is that gonna get you what you want? What do you actually want out of this conversation? Right? And having that conversation right in the moment. I always say that like the time between a young person feels an emotion and when they get to work through it, this delta is when you make bad decisions.
100%.
So if we can decrease that time and or like help them process it in a way that is healthy, then that's life changing. That's life saving, especially when we're looking at, emotions and think about like your middle school self. That it's like, it's a roller coaster. So and unfortunately, because they're exposed to so much more, you're exposed to a lot more extreme actions too. So we're seeing just by having these early interventions, we're creating a lot more support for students before they start experimenting with much, scarier things.
Man, this is so cool. Did you ever have a conversation with yourself where it's like, man, when I was in middle school, when I was in high school, as I was at a younger age, I wish I would have had this and it would have helped me make better decisions when I navigated some of these life challenges that we come across?
Oh, for sure. This is a fully selfish endeavor. This is what I wish I had when I was 15. So that's why. I mean, people always say, founders will build something for them, for themselves, or for the community they know so well. And I was your perfectionist who would, I mean, still sometimes am, who is strong and doesn't need anyone's help, very independent, and I can figure it out on my own until I couldn't. And if I had had the support when I was 15, let me just say I would save a lot of money on therapy now. And it would have been a lot easier on my relationship with my mom. We talk about this all the time. I get her. We're Colombian, but she speaks Spanish. So every time we do any sort of parent communication in Spanish, I'm like, "Hey, mom, check this out. Can you just tell me what you think?" And the last time I sent it to her, she's like, "Oh my God, if we had had this, it would be so much easier."
Seriously. I mean, even not just supporting the kiddo, but also supporting mom and dad, right? So even like a
Hmm.
multifunctional type of solution. I want to know a little bit about your jumping across the chasm from going from a 9 to 5, right, to being a
Mm.
CEO and founder and going to a 24/7 365. So what is that process like for you? Are you having conversations with friends, with your family? I'm going to take this jump. I'm going to start my own thing. What is that early day like?
So I had always thought I wanted to start a company, and really, I think it was because two reasons. One, my dad's a civil engineer, and he had a construction business growing up, so I'd always seen him kind of running his own thing, and I thought that was, yeah, it felt exciting to me. And then, of course, I went to Stanford, and they like feed you something in the water there to make you be an entrepreneur. I don't know how they do it, but it's magic. So, I was very exposed in a lot of ways, and what I was looking for, because I had seen other people build companies, is, and I knew how hard it could be. I wanted a problem that I was so passionate about that I not only like didn't mind working the 24/7 365, but that it didn't feel like work most of the time because I was so excited and passionate about it. And it wasn't until I saw this article that we referenced earlier that I was like, that's it. That's the thing. And Steve Jobs has this quote that he says, like, when you don't see the dots connect looking forward, but you can always see them connect looking back. And I remember being in this moment where there's like all these different experience points or all these people that I had met that I'm like, wow, it all makes sense. Like I was meant to do this. Everything from like taking AP Psych in 10th grade and like being obsessed with psychology ever since.
Dude,
So,
literally, this is so interesting to me. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I was
no,
listening to
no.
a podcast. Chris Williamson, it's called Modern Wisdom. He recently just hosted Matthew McConaughey, and they get
Mm,
onto the question about, do you believe in fate? And Matthew, in his age of wisdom, says, when I was younger, I always thought that things were happening at random. I would run into somebody at the Starbucks, or I would miss somebody and I would actually meet somebody else who I became best friends with. But when you have the perspective of life and you can zoom out, it seems like everything has been incredibly methodical and mathematically aligned to give you the opportunities that kind of put you on a path that you can find your passion. And I've just been like tapping into that message. And like when I have a tough day or I don't know how this experience is going to affect me, it's all connected in some way. I just can't really see the dots in front of me, but I sure as shit can see them behind me, which is
mm-hmm.
crazy. That I'm stealing that quote, by the way. That's actually killer. That's me using that one every day.
I'm so glad it resonates. And so I quit my job in September, and then I had seen this article in like July, and I literally emailed the CEO in that moment. I was like, "Hey, so I got to talk to you tomorrow." I made the decision right then and there, and I ended up leaving in September, and then this didn't start until like November, December.
Mm-hmm.
And it was during that time, those like 2, 3 months in between, uh, I read this other book that basically has that same message. It's just like, the universe is basically aligning, conspiring to make it all work for you. And conspiring is the word, not conspiring. When I was reading, I was like, this is, woo woo stuff. But then I started connecting all these dots. I'm like, wait, you know, the universe knows. The universe is just there. It's doing its thing. So I, it gave me, I think, a lot of confidence to jump into it. And, because I had had a lot of different experiences that were valuable. So much of what investors will talk about in this like pre-seed seed stages is not so much product market fit, but like founder market fit and founder product fit. And as I was sort of tapping into a lot of this, it became a really clear. There was a lot of alignment for why this is a work that I wanted to do and needed to do. And that then ended up shining through, I think, in the conversations with investors and with team members on the road.
What is your reaction when you have so much conviction? You go in and speak with an investor and they're just like, nah, Maria, I just really don't believe in this. I'm sure you guys are going to do great stuff, but like, this isn't for us. What do you kind of do in that moment? Like to either revalidate yourself or put them on like the hater list? What does that look like for you?
Thankfully, I had a lot of practice with that. In the previous company, we were it was also in education technology, and we pitched a lot of investors for the Series A. And let's say like a lot of investors, especially at that time, like didn't. This was like 2015, 2014, didn't like selling into schools, didn't like selling into education, and so we would have these what we thought were great conversations, and they'd be like, "Yeah, no thanks." Um, and it was great character building. And in that example, like the company wasn't my baby, right? It wasn't. I was chief of staff and was doing a lot of impactful work there, but it wasn't like my baby at the core. Uh, and so I learned a lot about like what to expect from that experience. And then when I started having conversations, a lot of them are happening on Zoom, whereas before everything would happen in person. So in a way, it's harder, but it's easier. It's like harder to connect with someone because you're not seeing them in person, and instead of this like small talk where you can break the ice, you're basically just like jumping into it. Um, but it's also easier because you can bounce back a lot faster, right? So it would be, okay, we have a conversation, and there definitely were some patterns that I started to identify early on. And
Do you
if it
mind
didn't,
sharing those patterns? This is really interesting to me because I want to give as much value for the audience as possible here.
definitely. So because we were talking about youth mental health, if an investor had a kid in that preteen, teenage
Yeah, the
age,
target audience, right?
they got it.
Mm,
Because they're like, oh yeah, my kid is blah 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 blah, and like they would just open up really quickly, and they understood why we were building what we were building a lot faster. If they didn't, it was harder for them to see it, unless they were working like mental health space more generally and had a good understanding of that, of the needs in general. But that was a big. So right away, you're okay. I'm realizing, okay, we need to start with a little bit of like a introduction to see, will you get the problem? Do I have to like explain why this matters, or will you
right.
just get it? So that's one example. And I think, depending on the company that you're building and depending on the product you're building, trying to identify, what's gonna get people to connect to your solution. Because at the end of the day, we're all humans, right? So we're all making emotional solutions in some or decisions in some way. That went a long way. I would say the other thing that I did, and it wasn't even on purpose, but I started while remember we were talking about how we were building the product with a very user-centered design process. I Through that process, I was also talking to investors, and I was get trying to get their feedback. I'm saying, look, like they're seeing all these companies, they're seeing all these business models. Like, hey, this is what I'm thinking about. Does this resonate? Does this not? Like, which companies are you excited about that are doing good work in the space that I should look at? And made it a much more like collaborative conversation from that perspective. So when we were getting to a point where we wanted to raise money, it wasn't a cold introduction like, hey, want to give me some of your dollars, but it was a like, oh, you've been giving us feedback, and they're like, wait, I see why this can work. um how can I help, and like, what do you need to make this work? So one thing I tell entrepreneurs is like, always ask for advice, because when investors are putting their like advice giving hat on, they're looking at reasons why it is going to work, and like they're looking at the bright spots, and they're looking at like how you can put this together and make it work. When you ask them for money, they're looking at all the reasons why it's not going to work.
Mm. Dude, what a subtle way to attack the problem, but also the mind share and the knowledge of
Hmm.
these individuals who are exposed to so many different opportunities and deals. Very smart. Wow. And then this is something that you intuitively picked up on, or this is from your education experience and you guys are trying to go out and raise and be able to kind of get traction as well?
I think I kind of stumbled up on it,
Yeah.
honestly. Yeah, it's a happy finding.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And this is one of the things I really wanted to emphasize was when I first got into the space of healthcare in 2014, I saw all of these innovative solutions like patient portals and things that were developed in a vacuum, right? And I say a vacuum because there was no user engagement and user input actually put into the development of these solutions. Then they went out to the marketplace and said, "Hey guys, check it out." And everybody was like, "I will never do that." And it's interesting to see how when you are user centric, you can develop solutions to problems that people are actually identifying themselves. So when you come to the marketplace, there's no guessing. And I feel like a lot more younger entrepreneurs and older entrepreneurs need to lean into that feedback cycle to avoid some of the pitfalls and the heartbreak, honestly, that comes along with thinking that this is my baby, I'm going to take it to the marketplace. And everybody's like, we don't need that. And that doesn't really solve my problem, which is something that I think we need to focus on more.
Hmm. Yeah, this Stanford talks a lot about this. It's just like this idea of get out of the building. And I have a strong point of view. I mean, we talk a lot about, do we interview versus do we show? Like, I find that people, I mean, what people say and what people will do, especially in a healthcare, like a stigmatized space, can be at conflict. And they're like, oh yeah, I would never. I mean, but I think actually, online dating is a great example of this. If someone asks you like, are you willing to like go on this app and like swipe on people, you'd be like, I'm so cool, I can just go to a bar and find people to talk to. I don't need that. And and the reality is there's a lot of people sitting at home that are like doing the thing, but they wouldn't have done it if they wouldn't have said yes if someone asked them, right?
But I also think about the original days of like when internet dating first popped up, people were
Hmm.
like, oh my God, those people are so weird. You're sitting in a basement somewhere, you're talking to a troll, XYZ. And now it's like, I don't even know the percentage of people who are finding their actual partner through an online platform. It becomes the norm. So it's like you almost have to be brave enough to go out into these spaces, take a couple arrows to the chest, and be willing to say, I'm going to plant my flag here and wait for the entire crowd and population to catch up. Because naturally, when I'm thinking about I've sold into higher education, middle schools, high schools, and things like that. Did you ever come across the objection of like, well, who are these coaches on the other side of the platform? Because we don't want to just introduce our kids to some strangers. What was that kind of objection like? How'd you overcome that?
Oh, for sure. We get that question every day, and we tell them who they are. They're incredible people. Many of them are former educators, right? A lot of educators left the classroom during COVID, and where they're going through a robust training or they have to be ICF certified. And where, yeah, we're very transparent about that. That comes up all the time. And where that goes back to this idea of this is another, I think, really good lesson that I learned from one of our investors. It's like every question is an objection.
Mm.
So if you internalize that during any sales conversation, then you redesign your pitch or the way you answer that question in a different way, right? So like what's behind that question of who are the coaches? They're really asking like, can I trust you? Is this safe? How will I explain this to my families? So then you create collateral, you create the response based on that. So oftentimes what's being asked is not it's not the surface level question, not like they actually want to know like exactly who they are, right? It's all these things that are being unsaid that are actually the objection.
And the objective, right, is to be able to pitch a value proposition, your guys' service, right, and have zero objections. That means you guys have to be able to architect the presentation to be able to overcome those questions even before they pop up. That's one of the things that me and my team have really focused on is like that surface level objection, right, is never really the reason. We have to be able to dig underneath that and figure out what it's really about. Man. So, what do you think has been the biggest lesson that you've learned about yourself, about business, about leadership in the years in which you started this? Being a CEO and a founder, the responsibility and the weight of leadership is intense, and it often teaches us a lot about ourselves. So, what kind of lessons have you learned about Maria as you've gone through this whole journey with yourself?
A lot of people ask me this is like how do you balance, I talk about this like mental health and startups are kind of like an oxymoron.
Yeah.
Going back to this 24/7 365. But what I've learned is there's certain things that I can't compromise on. So I need to sleep. Like I will not give up sleep. And that has been, I think, the biggest lesson about myself, that like if I don't get 8 to 10 hours of sleep a night, I am a crankier
Hmm.
and less effective human overall. So it is in my and the company's best interest that I get that sleep. Um, and for some people, it might be like they definitely need to work out that day. They need to eat XYZ. They need to like have a certain ritual, like whatever that might be. I think really understanding, like I notice a big difference in my energy levels and my mood when I don't sleep. So what might that be for you as an entrepreneur or as a leader, so that you can show up in the best way?
Have you
That's the
learned
biggest
those
Maria.
lessons? Have
Mhm.
you learned those lessons kind of in a tough way? I have a personal experience with sleep. There was this big release of a program. You ever heard of a guy named Alex Hermosi? He
Mhm.
is acquisition.com. Him and his wife Layla, they have a family office, do like 500 million a year, like 34 years old. So these kids are killing it, right? They did a release. Alex did a big book release where he released like all of his like frameworks for how he creates content and how he builds teams and XYZ. And I was so excited, right, that I like literally got no sleep. I popped an Adderall, I went through the entire night, got no sleep. And then guess what happened? The 2 weeks after that, I was absolute dog shit
Mhm.
because I got so excited that I didn't establish my own boundaries. And ever since then, I've recognized that there's no such thing as overworked, there's only under rested. And I'm also in that 8 to 10 hour sleep person. And I always used to give myself such a tough time because I was like, Keen, you can't be sleeping. Like, this is entrepreneurship. This is about the grind 24/7. But it's like, dude, if I can't show up with not only a plethora of physical energy, but also emotional energy to be able to regulate myself, I'm never going to be able to show up for my team, which truly needs me to support them and pour into them, which was a big maturity lesson in my personal entrepreneurship journey as well.
That is so big and resonates. I love this, not overworked but underrested. I'm going to use that as well. I'm
Take it.
stealing that one. It resonates so much, and it's so simple in a lot of ways, right? And it affects so much.
I had the privilege of interviewing a guy on the podcast. He was a brain surgeon with a PhD in neuroscience, and I asked him, what is the most important skill set a human being in general can develop? And I was expecting him to be like focus, time management, XYZ. He said emotional regulation.
Mm,
Because anytime you come across a situation that gets you frazzled emotionally, it impacts the way you see the world, how you hear things, how you perceive people's behavior, and you can't make clear decisions in that moment. So, emotional regulation, number one skill set to be able to
mm,
develop. And ever since then, I've really kind of focused on how can I show up as the most emotionally regulated? Because I'm not saying that I'm hard on myself, but I'm definitely aware when I don't have the amount of rest, when I'm not properly fueled, if that's water or food, and I get a little hangry, right? I'm a little quick sometimes to react to situations in my team. And I just want to hold myself to a higher standard of accountability so I can be the person who is, that sets the tempo in the organization. But that's a role of leadership that I didn't truly understand when I started my journey either.
mhm. Yeah, so much of what you're almost like a mirror for everybody else, right? And like they'll match your energy and match your mood. Uh, so one thing I started doing is like, okay, in this meeting, like, how do I want to show up? Right? And sometimes you do need to be the like hustle grind, like go, let's go, go, go. And sometimes people need more grace. And I would say like as a leader, always thinking about, because we are in the mental health space, we can have more open conversations about mental health and burnout and like what's getting in the way. And it's not just like what tool is getting in the way, but like what are the things that are blocking you internally? What causes you that freeze state? What causes the you to get paralyzed when you're trying to do work? And what are ways that like we can work together to not have that happen anymore, right? So like you don't like my tone in Slack and you're reading into it, let's hop on a call and then move through it quickly, because we're all humans and we all have emotions and we're all sensitive and we all want to do a good work. So how do we not let sort of micro interactions ruin that along the way?
since you've been in this journey for a long time, right? Entrepreneurship, we've talked about, and leadership in itself really is a mirror, right? We have to be able to look at ourselves through the way in which we interact with others, how they react to us, XYZ. Have you ever started to focus, or have you gotten deep into the path of like personal development in this journey with yourself? Or have you gotten into that? Are you not so much interested? What's kind of your 2 cents on personal development?
I mean, I think I always need to be growing and learning myself. And like we're a coaching company, so I have like three different coaches that I'll talk to.
Yeah.
And sometimes that comes from, investors. Sometimes growth can come from even like other team members. And we have like ongoing performance cycles where we're not talking about like just the work, but like what am I doing that is blocking you, or what am I doing that's not serving you as an individual. So I hope that I am like a more evolved person, basically, if not every day, definitely every week.
Yeah, I mean, I put a ton of effort into learning to be the best version of Keenan. Right. One of the stories that I often tell myself, and this is really the first time I've actually kind of said this on the podcast, is, I have such a responsibility to the men and women who came before me. My great grandfather was a sharecropper in Arkansas. My grandfather was born in the 1930s as a black man, discriminated against for the color of his skin, fought for everything just to give his children an opportunity to be represented equally. My father was the first entrepreneur in my family who did things that were so outside the scope of what everybody else did that it gave me the opportunity to do this with you here today.
Mhm.
My responsibility is to continue to become the version of Keenan who those men and women can be proud of. But also, when I look into the future and think about the generations, hopefully, that will come after me, then they're going to be proud of me too. And they have a foundation to be building on. But one thing I've also recognized is I've gotten a lot of flack for the personal development trajectory of my life, right? I've outgrown a lot of friends. I can't continue to be the 30-year-old, the 34-year-old who goes out to the club on a Thursday and drinks with everybody else. And I get a lot of flack for that. I didn't go to Stanford. So have you found yourself outgrowing your peers, although you came from such a prestigious institution? Or like, what does that personal development trajectory look like for you? And what's the impact on your personal circle of friends?
That is such a good question. I have like that resonates a lot, and yes, I do not basically talk to. I maybe have like two or three people that I talk to from high school. Because yeah, it's just like we don't really see. We're not really living in the same life, or like the same circles. Um, so that resonates a lot for sure. There's a lot that I do for myself to like create those boundaries. And yeah, because you're right, like I can't go to a club on a Thursday, and like I need to go to bed at a certain time in order to get that those 8 to 10 hours. And I've been a lot more intentional, I would say, in like the friendships that I nurture as a result of that. And at the same time, like I am also someone who wants to have like and like has a great group of friends and like a very supportive group of friends. But now like the way that we bond might be more about this, you know, talking about these hard things that we're dealing with at work, as opposed to, gossiping about who knows what else. So it's just like the conversation changes. And I would say in general have, if I think about like who's given me flack, it's like my family thinks like I work a lot, and has definitely, I think it's been hard for them to see how much I have to work to make this work. But at the same time, they're very supportive, and they're trying to understand. Like I know that they're trying to take care of me, right? So they're like, make sure you're sleeping, make sure you're doing this, make sure you get some rest. And I'm like, yeah, yeah, I'm prioritizing it. Don't worry. But when they're like, make sure you're like going out with friends, I'm like, right now it's not the time, right? I'm like, I'm in focus mode, and that's okay. And like, yes, I will find balance at another time, and just helping them. I'll go into my cave, and then helping them see that like I'll balance it out eventually.
Do you ever have trouble focusing when it comes to doing like deep work in any of your tasks? Do you ever find yourself distracted by the notifications, the emails, the YouTube, the Instagram, the TikTok, all that kind of stuff?
I would say that my superpower, one of my superpowers is my ability to just like dive into something and be able to focus on it. But I only do that after hours. So, once the team, essentially like my day structure so that I'm like in meetings throughout the whole day, talking to customers, going in and out. And then probably after like, if I'm on the West Coast, it's like 2 to 3 Pacific. Um, it starts to get quieter because we have a lot of people on the East Coast. That's when I can do more like deep dive work. And same thing, or like if there's big projects, I'll leave that for a weekend to just be able to dive in. Uh, it's not so much that like I'll get distracted in that I want to be able to unblock the person from the question that they have, right? Not because it's like, oh, shiny object.
Yeah.
um and but yeah, like I can't really listen to music while I'm working. I'm very just
You're a psychopath, just like me. I sit in my office all day, quiet. My business partner and younger sister like comes over to work in the office sometimes, and she'll be like, "Why are we not playing music?" And I'm like, "Do we need music to focus?" But the reason why I bring that question up about focus is I'm reading a book right now called Deep Work by Cal
Mm,
Newport. And in this book, he talks about the skill set, and the greatest ideas and innovations have come from those who have been able to block out the distractions of the world, right? And
mm,
actually focus on a task. And then as we go through the process of reading the book, you start learning about like all of the super villains of distraction and taking our time away from us that have been engineered by these billion-dollar companies, incredibly smart individuals and behavioral scientists who are willing to develop these tools to keep us coming back for more. And I often think about one of the biggest obstacles to us accomplishing our dreams is the distractions that we deal with every day.
mm,
Average 18-year-old today spends about 9 hours an hour or 9 hours a day on screen time. That's on their personal cell phone. Over the time of their lifetime, that's 24 years of their life that they'll be taken away from them. I know, think about it, by just scrolling, right? The average American adult today is not far behind by spending about 8.5 hours per day on screen time. So when you think about those numbers over the rest of their lifetime, we're talking about years and years and often decades of time that you don't have control over. So when you
mhm.
want to accomplish great things like impacting the next generation's mental health or innovating in the healthcare space like I do, you need to be a protector of your most valuable resource. It's not your money, it's your time and your focus, which is something that I think we need to have a conversation about more, because the way in which we're going does not seem like it's a result for creating amazing things that have huge impact.
We hear a lot from students too, where they're looking for ways to focus and to be less distracted and to be able to sit. And I was actually talking to some people from Common Sense Media earlier this week around the different how TV shows for kids are made now, and how the when you
Please
look
tell.
at like Coco Melon, it's in every scene there's something moving. So you're just like constantly being bombarded with action and movement and little dopamine hits in your brain. Uh, and they did some studies where they showed like today's children's shows compared to 90s or like Blue's Clues or like Teletubbies or something. And when they turn them off, the kids who are watching today's shows are like addicted. They want more. They're like throwing tantrums because they want to watch more TV. And when they turn the 90s shows off, they're like, okay, like we can go outside and play. So it's like the level of addiction is so different. And that sets the stage for everything else on, as they're growing, as their brains are developing, right? So if you think that, yeah, it's like TikTok, you're seeing all these things moving, you're like scrolling, you have endless content at your fingertips, that has to have an effect on how your brain is developing, and that impacts your ability. I mean, you can't watch like a 5-minute video anymore. I'm like, it's either 30 seconds or we're not watching it. And that's a loss.
I mean, it's a huge loss. I mean, your ability to focus and at least sit somewhere, right? I always got in trouble because I was a daydreamer when I was a kid. This is before the prevalence
Mm,
of like ADHD and everything. I'd always get in trouble because I'd be like looking out the window, thinking about like what I was going to do after school. I had an amazing individual on the podcast, Dr. Robert, and he was the former head of the Massachusetts Applied Behavioral Analysis Board. And we were talking about this upcoming generation of diagnosis with ADHD and everything else that comes along with that, right? And he was like, it's interesting to think about how we have an entire generation who's being diagnosed with attention deficit disorder. Yet when you take them into an environment like nature, often so many of those kiddos who can't sit still in a classroom, right, will be so enveloped and just invoked in the process of being outside that they don't have any attention issues. They have an engagement
Mm-hmm.
issue. And he said, if you look at the things in which they're exposed to at a young age, all the hyper pigmented and dialed in blues and reds and greens that get our brain to release that dopamine, plus cocomelon and everything else that comes with all the movement, no wonder nobody can sit still these days. And
Mm-hmm.
so it makes me kind of think about from like, I'm going to put like my tin hat on. Is this just like a systematic ability to keep all of our younger generations and our society in general consistently consuming and looking for the next thing rather than being able to sit with themselves with peace and actually be able to think about ideas that can change the world? You know, maybe that's a little bit too crazy for this episode, but you know, that's something I think about.
Yeah, I mean, I think more about what like business models and like what are companies being prized for and measured on. And we were talking about Duolingo, and like Duolingo is doing great work. And my sister's fiance is probably like 2 years into learning Spanish. No, probably more. Maybe call it 3 years into learning Spanish, and has he's gonna be mad I called him out. Has his his streak, but his Spanish, like he's had to find other ways to learn Spanish because the gamification and the levels aren't enough, right?
Yeah.
So how are we differentiating between this like snack type of engagement, or yeah, like call it engagement, versus like a meal, right? And like what's truly nutritious versus like what's just a snack, and then there's all kinds of snacks. Like you can have an apple for a snack, but you could also have like flaming Doritos, and what does that mean for how you're actually nourishing your brain?
One of the things that I think about is the ability to critically think about the things that we're exposed to is going to become a superpower of the future. You know, in this book, again, as you were kind of talking there was a small passage that said, you know, we came from a society before the internet where everybody was skeptical about a solution that was put in front of us, like it was going to be the end all be all silver bullet to solve this problem. Then the internet dropped, and we also found ourselves that the companies that were being started by 20 somethings who we had no idea what they were doing, but they came to the marketplace with a solution. And because it came from the internet, it was looked at as being the truth or being the all saving solution for this problem. And we've lost the ability to critically think about the solutions that we engage with and think about how they're impacting us on a daily basis. So yes, Duolingo, great opportunity for people to learn languages. 1,000-day streak of how I've engaged and gone through my little programs, awesome. But if you go to Mexico or Colombia or somewhere else and you can't have a conversation in the language, although you got your 2,600-day streak going on, then we need to reevaluate the tools that we're using, which
Mhm.
is really interesting to think about.
And how can Duolingo get measured not on just on those as a company,
Mm-hmm.
not on the streaks, but on are people actually learning?
Man,
Like
change the
why doesn't
incentives, change the
yeah,
outcome. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Like if all they're reporting is their monthly active users or the daily active users, like that's what investors care about. But what if they were to report on people who actually, I mean, then the question is about like how do you measure that, blah blah blah. There's lots to figure out there, but it I think so much of our the problems that we're seeing on social media, in the general media, right, is we're incentivized to polarize content and to create these like clickbait news and to post things that are going to get a reaction out of people because that's what is monetized. And there's a lot of issues with that.
I mean, in 2021, maybe 2020, there was a documentary that came out on Netflix called The Social Dilemma. And it talked about, right, the power of social media is not connecting the world, but changing your behavior in such small ways that you don't even notice it. I was having a conversation with a younger entrepreneur. Kid's like, 21, 22 years old. And he was talking about his scheme of how him and his friends are creating all of these skit-based content pieces for TikTok. And they're using the virality of those pieces of content to be able to drive people to the TikTok shop so they can get an affiliate purchase on the energy supplement that they put on the TikTok shop. And I was like, think about what you just said. You're spending your time creating false content to get other people to engage with the skit that you produce to be able to drive them towards this. If you think about how these platforms have been created, you are the product because you're trying to take everybody else's attention, just how they're trying to take yours. And the people who are actually benefiting are the people who own the platform. It's like we need to take a little bit of a different perspective and zoom out and think about where we're spending our time, because continuously investing into the perpetuating system of fake content is only going to get worse in the coming years. And
Yeah.
it's an interesting time. And that's why I believe in the podcast so much, because we can have real conversations that aren't just about a snippet in time, you know?
Yeah, I think the content creation piece is going to change a lot. I mean, you're already seeing how AI can create all this content at the, click of a button. That we're going to see a lot of content that's low quality.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, how do we help people differentiate and prioritize content accordingly? Um, we love that there's some things that are more accessible, right? And that like you're now going to be able to put any language captions on this podcast. Like that's wonderful. That's great. That's a great use of that technology. But how do we not lose the humanity along the way?
And that's, I think, a great place for us to kind of put the wheels down and leave on that question. You know, one of the traditions we have here, Maria, on the podcast is our previous guest wants to ask you a blind question. So this is going to be an interesting one. When you find yourself in challenging times and you might not have 100% belief in yourself and those feelings of imposter syndrome creep in, how do you correct that conversation with yourself? And what are your coping mechanisms to deal with those feelings of doubt?
We actually just did this with our team earlier this week and at all hands. We we're putting together, I don't know what to call it yet. I'm open to suggestions. But it's essentially like a folder of validation that like we first went through an exercise of explaining like what's your why? Why do you do this work? And then it's like what are proof points that you're doing the things that you want to do and that you're accomplishing. We're moving towards that why. And then getting into a habit of like when you see something, putting it into that folder so that when you feel down, you're able to basically pick one from that. We're talking about putting into a jar. So like pick one from the jar and have that be like, okay, yes, like I am doing this work. Like have that be sort of the shift in narrative and get back into it. So one of the things that I do if we're ever, if there's questions in like after an investor conversation, for example, that doesn't go so well, I'm like, I go into our feedback channel and I read what kids have to say, and I'm like, you know what? Literally impacting the lives of hundreds of kids today, like it's okay. And that helps me kind of get recentered into why I'm doing this. And also like again connects me to that user, who's like the whole reason why we're building this in the first place.
Maria, it's easy to understand why you are the definition of Hart and Hustle. I really appreciate you for coming on the show and sharing your story and diving into so many of these amazing topics. Seriously, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. This has been really fun.
And that's a wrap, guys. Catch you in the next one.